So today I want to talk about an important distinction and a bit of context for starting with the Barry-Harris system or approach or whatever you want to call it. We don't talk about bebop scales, and the reason for that will become obvious in a second. Secondly, there are two different types of scales in the Barry-Harris system. There's a scales for improvisation, sometimes called the added note rules or added note scales. And there are scales for constructing chords and chord movements, which are called the minor sixth, major sixth, so on. The scale of chords, you also might have heard it called. These are two distinct entities. In fact, Barry-Harris would teach improvisation and harmony separately, as separate classes, okay? There is obviously overlap, but it's good to look at them as separate things. The confusion stems from the term bebop scale and the fact that often in sort of mainstream jazz education stuff, you'll read things like we use the bebop scale to make block chords or mechanical voicings. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, we might have the C major bebop scale, as it's called, which is like an ordinary, regular C major scale, but with added notes, which is the flat 6 or the sharp 5, depending how you look at it. And this makes it possible to construct a scale of chords like this. I'm using drop 2s in this case, using sixth chord inversions followed by diminished chords, and so on. Okay. This is identical to the sort of stuff that we might play when we're learning Barry-Harris for the first time, right? It's not where we end up with it. There's a lot more to it than that. But that's like one of the first exercises we do, right? Okay. On the other hand, bebop scales are also used as a linear device. So, for instance, that's a bebop scale, for instance. You often hear these talked about in books like the Jazz Theory book or Randy Vincent's books, for instance. Okay, so these two things are, in mainstream jazz education, considered the same thing. Not so in Barry-Harris's teaching. We have 4 scales of chords that we use. And the first one is identical to the one we just played, which is the major sixth diminished. It's called in Barry-Harris land. So that is the C major scale with the added flat 6 or sharp 5. And we can start by constructing these sorts of things and eventually doing more interesting stuff like country motion and things with this system, borrowed notes, that kind of stuff, all kinds of cool stuff. And then we have the minor sixth, which is the same thing, minor sixth diminished, same thing. This is sometimes called the melodic minor bebop scale, I think, which is just like the same thing but with a flat 3, basically. So both of those are recognizable bebop scales. I think even Alan Holdsworth mentions them in his workshop.
This is just like a B flat major scale, but it has the raised fifth in it as well. So essentially, that's what that is. It's, the
next two are not the same, right? The dominant bebop scale. Dominant diminished. And that actually goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, natural 7th, root. And the reason why that's different from the usual bebop scale is because actually we're using the diminished scale. The diminished scale has the notes, if we use the one below the half step below the root, that has the notes 7, 2, 4 and flat 6 in. So it has to have a flat 6, right? On the other hand, we add in the notes of the dominant chord, which are 1, 3, 5, flat 7, and that gives you that scale. And the next step further out is to have the dominant flat 5. And if we add diminished to that, we get this very interesting scale, which goes 1, 2, 3, 4, flat 5. So it's like, and then we get a flat 6, and then we get a flat 7, and then 7 and a 1. So actually we end up with this kind of pattern. In sort of 3 semitones in a row, separated by a tritone. It has some really cool sounds in it. I mean, it's a great sounding scale. Really crunchy, lots of these really interesting sort of sounds in it. But it's not what we might think of as being a conventional bebop scale. On the other hand, the scales for soloing are different again. So these bebop scales are just the most simple options. This is what happens if you just want to add one note in, and that's a good idea if we start on the beats and on a chord tone. So for instance, in the major, minor, dominant. But you can get much more complex than that. Even the simplest rules allow you to also instead add 3 notes. So if I'm playing the dominant, for instance, I would go starting on E for C7, E, E flat, D, D flat, C, B, B flat, and then go down the rest of the scale as per normal. So it would sound like this. Or you even get scales where you add in basically every note of the chromatic scale, like this. And it's still C7. So anyway, I hope that explains the basics a little bit better, just so you can make that distinction. There's material out there, including on my own channel and on Chris Park's excellent channel, Things I Learned from Barry Harris, which I'll definitely recommend. But I just wanted to sort of clear that up. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe, all the rest of it. Thanks for watching.